Back in 2001, the Mini brand was resurrected. Mini's mission was to sell you a small, efficient, front-wheel drive, luxury or near-luxury hatchback, however you want to classify Mini. Now, why am I talking about Mini when there's a BMW sitting right next to me? That's because, of course, BMW owns Mini. And part of the mission for the Mini brand was to improve BMW's overall sales volume and, most importantly, improve BMW's corporate average fuel efficiency numbers. Having the Mini brand around arguably allowed the BMW brand to stay a little bit more pure in the eyes of some American shoppers, because back in 2001, every BMW sold in America was rear-wheel drive. But since then, a few things have changed. Mini sales haven't exactly gone where BMW would probably like them to go. I expect that in the calendar year 2020, the X1, X2, and this 2 Series Gran Coupe will outsell the entire Mini brand in the US. We'll of course have to wait till December to find that out, but that's how it's looking at the moment. And of course, we have a rise in front-wheel drive luxury entries from Mercedes and Audi, not to mention Volvo as well. And that's exactly why BMW has finally broken down and brought us their trio of entry-level vehicles in America. The X1, the X2 are the entry-level crossovers in the BMW lineup, and this 2 Series Gran Coupe, even though they're trying to call it a coupe or a coupe, however you want to pronounce it, this really is a 4-door sedan with a trunk. Now, even though this wears the 2 Series name, this shares absolutely nothing with the other 2 Series, the real 2 Series coupe in America. This is a front-wheel drive vehicle, that's a rear-wheel drive vehicle that's more closely related to the BMW 3 Series and 4 Series. This is more closely related to the Mini product line and, of course, the BMW X1 and X2. The designers certainly went for an aggressive look up front. I like this design more than the design we find in the A-Class or the CLA or the Audi A3. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. We have LED headlamps up front, a big, bold kidney grille. Entry-level luxury in America isn't quite as compact as entry-level luxury in Europe. So at 178.5 inches long, this is not small for Europe, but it is definitely small for America. This is one of the smaller sedans you'll be able to find here. This is about the same size as the Mercedes-Benz A-Class. Mercedes has 2 entry-level sedans in America, the A and the CLA. The CLA is notably longer. From the side profile, you'll notice that this is instantly recognizable as a BMW. We have very similar shapes to the 3 Series going on, except for up front. They've tried to disguise it a little bit by giving us a longer dash-to-axle ratio than we see in some front-wheel drive vehicles out there, but we do have a longer front overhang than we find in other BMWs. Now, all 228s are going to be all-wheel drive. There is no technical, actual front-wheel drive version of this available, but it is a front-wheel drive-based vehicle. The benefit to going front-wheel drive is space efficiency, because we have more interior room than you'd expect out of a vehicle this size if it was rear-wheel drive. Now, really interestingly, the only rear-wheel drive entry in this entry-level segment is now going to be the Cadillac CT4, although it is notably larger than this. Also notably larger than this, but obviously a direct competitor based on price, would be something like the Volvo S60. The S60 is logically a 3 Series competitor, but it does get less expensive than the 3 Series, right within the price range of this 228i. It may sound odd to compare a compact luxury sedan like the S60 to a subcompact vehicle in the next category down, but that's exactly what we used to see in the BMW lineup. BMW used to make a less expensive BMW 3 Series to compete directly with the A3 and the Mercedes-Benz CLA, but they've decided in this generation to make the 3 Series more premium, and the 228i is one of the vehicles that allows that to happen, because this fills out the bottom end of the segment, allowing the 3 Series to move up a little bit. This certainly looks a lot like the rest of the BMW family back here. We get a slightly more expressive lid to the little trunk there, and if we open this up, it really is more of a cargo slot than a true trunk, because there really is more vertical opening here than horizontal opening. When it comes to active safety technologies, we don't find the same level of safety gadgets standard on European luxury vehicles for some reason as we do find in Lexuses or Acuras. There are obviously going to be Lexus and Acura models that are in the same price range as this, and you will find more standard active safety tech. That even goes for safety-obsessed brands like Volvo. You won't find features like radar adaptive cruise control standard over there in the Swedish entries either. The result is a model like the one that we're looking at today. This has an MSRP of $52,000, but this does not have radar adaptive cruise control. It does, however, have a heads-up display, lane keeping assistance, blind spot monitoring, etc. At the moment, this model comes in 2 different flavors, the 228i and the 235i. Both of them use a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. This one produces 228 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. The M235i produces 301 and 332 out of a slightly different version of this engine. Both engines are mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission and standard all-wheel drive. They send the majority of the power to the front wheels under most driving situations, but the all-wheel drive system will of course kick power to the back when needed, but it will never send more than 50% of power to the rear unless there is front wheel slip. So this does not have a rear-biased torque vectoring system like we find in the Acura super handling all-wheel drive system. The 228i is the most efficient version in the US, 27 miles per gallon according to the EPA, and oddly enough, we've been getting better fuel economy this week in this than in the Honda CR-V hybrid that's parked right behind this. And if you want to go faster, there is the BMW M235i that will get you 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. Definitely a value performance entry in the BMW lineup. Fortunately, when it comes to front seat comfort, BMW doesn't skimp on the front seat designs in their less expensive vehicles, like we do see in some luxury companies out there. So we still have a multi-way adjustable power driver seat, 4-way adjustable lumbar support, inflatable side bolsters, and an extending thigh cushion in this model. We are driving an M Sport trim. The steering column is a manual tilt telescopic column, but it has a long range of motion. There's also a 2-position memory over there on the driver's door, and the passenger seat has almost the same range of motion as the driver's seat. It has the extending thigh cushion, it is a multi-way power seat with 4-way lumbar support, but it doesn't get the inflatable side bolsters. I think that's a pretty good compromise. If you take a look at entry-level or even mid-level Lexus and Acura models, they just don't have the same kind of seat adjustability that we find here. When I talk about front-wheel drive vehicles being more space efficient than rear-wheel drive vehicles, I am of course talking about things in general terms, not in specifics. Because if we're going to get specific, then BMW's 3 Series from 2007 is about the same length as this, and oddly enough, it has a little bit more rear room. Sitting right here behind myself with this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, you can see I have about an inch of legroom left and really very little headroom at all. I do have to crane my head severely to one side in order to even get back there towards the headrest. At 35.6 inches of rear seat headroom, this rear seat compartment is definitely very tight. You will certainly find more in the Audi A3 or the Volvo S60. They're still very sedan-shaped, and of course you'll find an awful lot more in BMW's X1. The X1 is enormous on the inside, so if you're looking for an entry-level BMW and you want a usable back seat, you may want to look at the X1 instead of the 2 Series. Things are also going to be a little bit tight if I try and scoot over here to the middle seat. Again, there's really no way that I can get back there to the headrest in that middle seat position. And if I try and go all the way over here to this side, the front seat's all the way back in its tracks. You can see my legs just won't fit behind the seat. And of course, there's still that headroom problem. Going a little bit out of order, one thing you'll really notice back here in the rear passenger area is BMW's attention to detail and the parts quality. You can see we have a very well integrated ambient light strip right in that sort of carbon fiber-esque trim. It has an interesting geometric pattern to it, and a lot of soft touch and premium materials going on here in the rear door area. Definitely more than we find in many of the Japanese competition. Certainly better appointed than we find in the Lexus and in the Acura. Although the 228 is playing the role of a subcompact sedan in America, we have more mid-sized sedan cargo room back here, 15.1 cubic feet. There are definitely mid-sized sedans in America, whether we're talking about luxury or mainstream sedans, that have less trunk space than this. As you can see, BMW has made this cargo compartment very, very square, so we don't really have any bump outs for the wheels or anything like that. That makes it very practical. And this divider can be removed. It comes in 3 sections right there. We find cargo load points right below that, but there's nowhere to store this. If you want to completely remove it from the vehicle, you are going to have to leave it somewhere. And as we've come to expect from European luxury sedans, there is no spare tire under there at all. That is the absolute bottom of the cargo area. As we look around this interior, keep in mind that we are in a model with a significant number of options. The MSRP on this model is about $52,000 after destination. You can see that we have a cover for this panoramic moonroof that is not completely opaque. It does let a decent amount of light through. It's a pretty decently sized sunroof for such a small vehicle. It goes to just over the rear passenger's knees. As we see in a number of other BMWs, we have fixed height shoulder belts, 2-way adjustable headrests. The model that we're driving has this very attractive chestnut brown leather interior. You can see the extending thigh cushion right over there on the passenger side. Again, the seat is not quite as adjustable as the driver's seat. The bolsters, which are moderately aggressive, are not adjustable on that side like they are on the driver's side. Moving over to the front door panels, we have a high percentage of soft touch materials, although as you'd expect in an entry-level vehicle, the bottom of the door panel is made from a hard plastic. The two-tone design is attractive, and as we go in closer, you can see the same light pipe right inside that door trim that we found in the back. Again, has kind of a geometric pattern. It kind of reminds me a little bit of carbon fiber. Moving over to the dashboard, we find a slot-style glove compartment. I was not able to fit a larger tablet computer inside, but some of those smaller ones might fit. The dashboard is made from soft touch injection molded plastics. We have some after stitching and some different textures going on that help dress things up a bit. Again, more of that similar metallic trim going on there. And in the center of the dashboard, this is very recognizable as a modern BMW. We have essentially the same BMW iDrive system that we find in the rest of the BMW lineup, very similar climate controls and infotainment buttons down there below. One nice touch is that this infotainment system supports wireless Apple CarPlay. This is one of the few vehicles in America to support that. And CarPlay does occupy the entire screen. Although I like the graphics that we see in the Mercedes-Benz A-Class and CLA's infotainment system and instrument cluster a bit better, I think that iDrive is more intuitive to use, so this would be my choice in the luxury segment. Below that, we have the controls for the dual zone climate control, and again, those infotainment controls. Continuing down there, we find a wireless charging mat right there for your phone, since we do have wireless CarPlay. Single USB connection right there, 12-volt power connection, 2 large cup holders. BMW has definitely been getting better at the cup holder game lately. And then behind that, we have a bank of the latest BMW buttons. Engine start, stop button over here, traction control, parking sensors off, start, stop system enable, disable. These are the drive modes, Sport, Comfort, and Eco Pro auto brake hold. Brake button right there. Our joystick style shifter, same one that we find in a wide variety of different BMWs, and then the latest controller for that BMW iDrive system. Between the front seats, we have a center console that is softly padded. It opens up to reveal a moderately sized storage compartment. Remember, this is all-wheel drive, so there is a little bit going on there under this console. We have a USB-C charge-only port inside. The full LCD instrument cluster has been borrowed out of some larger BMWs. Again, this is not as configurable as the Mercedes display. I think that's a little bit of a pity because we can do a lot of things with that Mercedes display that we don't see here. We do, however, have a moving map display there in the middle and a variety of different options over there on the right side. The display's theme changes a bit depending on the drive mode that we're in, but we don't have quite as many options again for the display layout as we find in the Mercedes line. We do, however, have BMW's excellent heads-up display. This is a lot crisper in person. Heads-up displays are really difficult to film for some reason. They just always appear a little bit blurry and a little bit flickery, but they don't look like this in person. This is a full-color display. It's a little bit more feature-rich than we find in some of the competitive heads-up displays. The steering wheel has also been borrowed out of larger BMWs. We have pretty aggressive sport grips up top, paddle shifters on the back with up on the right, down on the left. This is an M Sport steering wheel, so we have the little M logo down there, and then the steering wheel heat button is right there in the middle. On the left side of the wheel, we have infotainment buttons along with a voice command button and a phone button. On the left side, we have the buttons for the cruise control system and the speed limiter. This does not have a radar adaptive cruise control in the model that we're driving, so no buttons for that. The general consensus among car enthusiasts has long been that front-wheel drive cars aren't much fun and can't be much fun. And part of that is because front-wheel drive cars weren't found in the luxury segment or in the performance segment for many, many years. Instead, manufacturers went to front-wheel drive for cost savings, weight savings, fuel economy savings, etc., but those vehicles were not designed with performance and handling in mind. But today, we have a number of really great front-wheel drive vehicles, including vehicles in the mainstream, like the Honda Civic Type R, or this BMW 2 Series, the Mini product line, for instance, and the Mercedes-Benz CLA. The CLA is an astonishing amount of fun for a vehicle with the engine supposedly the wrong way around. Now, I don't think that this 2 Series is quite at the same level of the last CLA 250 that we tested. That had optional summer tires on it. They were incredibly grippy, and the model that we're driving has 225 with Bridgestone Turanza tires. These are more of a touring tire, so definitely keep that in mind. In our instrumented testing, we got 0 to 60 in 6 seconds even. That is exactly what BMW says we should get in this car. If you want to go faster, there's the M235i that will go 0 to 60 in 4.6. That 4.6 second time is definitely respectable. If you were to compare this to something like a Volvo S60 T6 with 316 horsepower, it is not that fast. On the other hand, it is going to be bigger and roomier. In our braking test, this model stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 120 feet. That is longer than the last CLA that we tested or the last S60 that we tested, again because of the tires that we have on this model. 225 width, these are definitely more touring-focused tires. And that certainly has an effect on the handling score, as does the more front weight bias that we have in this vehicle. Nearly 60% of the weight is on the front axle. Overall weight balance is pretty similar to something like a Honda Civic or a Honda Accord, any of those mainstream front-wheel drive vehicles out there. But we have the added agility of all-wheel drive. And Mercedes has programmed this all-wheel drive system to send more power to the rear than many all-wheel drive systems we find in the mainstream segment. So this is certainly an upgrade over something like an all-wheel drive Subaru Legacy. You'll really notice that in corners like this, if I floor it, we definitely get a decent amount of grip. You can feel that extra power is being sent to the rear, but we still have that same dynamic that you'd find in a front-wheel drive, front-heavy car where the front end is going to plow into the corners a little bit. The rear end of this 228i is never going to step out on you like the rear-wheel drive 2 Series, or of course a 3 Series. When it comes to our handling score, I'm going to give this particular model a B. Again, keep in mind, this does have the Bridgestone Turanza tires on it, so depending on the tire you put on the 2 Series or you order from the factory, that handling score may change. Now that said, I do prefer the way that Mercedes has tuned the chassis and the suspension in the CLA. It feels a little bit more nimble out on the road, a little bit more engaging than the 2 Series. But on the other hand, the 228i is going to be faster than the CLA 250. In our tests, this was 0.2 of a second faster, and this is going to be an awful lot smoother. We don't have a dual clutch transmission. This is a traditional 8-speed Aisin automatic. Interestingly enough, essentially the same automatic transmission that we find under the hood of Lexus and Volvo competitors. But the BMW software for this 8-speed automatic is definitely better than we find in the Volvo lineup or in the Lexus lineup. It has a more direct feel to it. It definitely feels a little bit quicker shifting, but not as quick shifting as the ZF 8-speed that we find, of course, in the BMW 3 Series. So it's not going to be that level of engagement. Out on a rougher road like the gravel road that we're out on now, the Turanzas definitely give a slightly softer ride than something like a sports tire would, but these are still pretty low profile, 40 series tires in the model that we're driving, and so this is going to be a little bit more firm than something like a Lexus UX or the BMW X1. We'll talk about this more later, but I think in many ways the 228i's greatest competitor is within the BMW envelope, and it's not necessarily the 3 Series, it's probably going to be the X1 or X2. The model that we're driving does not have an adaptive suspension system, and this suspension is tuned on the firm side. So when it comes to ride quality, I'm going to give this particular model a C. In our cabin noise test, we got 72.5 decibels in here. As with most of the subcompact or entry-level luxury options, we definitely get more cabin noise in here when you're out on a rougher road. Wind noise is well controlled, but there's just not as much sound deadening in the wheel wells. Keep in mind, again, we are driving the model with 225 width tires. If you want something quieter, there is the Volvo S60. It is generally speaking going to be a little bit quieter than this, or there's also the BMW X1, which I found quieter out on the road than this as well. Bear in mind that when I'm talking about the Audi A3 as a competitor, we are talking about the current generation model, not the new A3 that we do expect to see in America shortly. Over a week of mixed driving, fuel economy has been nothing less than shocking. We've been driving the 228 pretty hard, it's an awful lot of fun to drive, and we've still been averaging 29.2 mpg. That is several mpg more than the EPA score, and oddly enough, better fuel economy than we've been getting in the Honda CR-V Hybrid, which is supposedly rated for nearly 40 mpg. This has been going up and over the same 2,200-foot mountain pass every day as that Honda CR-V, driving in the same conditions, etc. And this gets excellent fuel economy even when hill climbing. I was particularly surprised by that. This is also quite efficient out on the open highway. So if you're looking for a high fuel efficiency vehicle for those longer highway drives, the 228i is going to be a little bit better in those situations than the BMW X1. Bottom lining the 228i out on the road is pretty easy. This is an awful lot more fun than you might suspect, but it's not as much fun as a BMW 3 Series. Nor is it as much fun as a Cadillac CT4. Interestingly enough, the CT4 is the only entry-level luxury vehicle left in America that is rear-wheel drive. And when we're talking about entry-level vehicles, we're talking about vehicles that start under $40,000. Now, the reason for that, of course, is that the CT4 really is more BMW 3 Series sized, but it's a little bit more 228i Gran Coupe priced. For 2020, this is not the least expensive BMW, so sorry if I misspoke that at any point in this video. This is not the least expensive BMW, period. This is the least expensive four-door BMW, because the 2 Series Coupe, which bears no relation to the 2 Series Gran Coupe, is actually a little bit less expensive at $35,300. However, arguably value is a little bit better if you opt for the four-door 2 Series, because at $37,500, we do have standard all-wheel drive and some of the more modern features that we find in the rest of the BMW lineup. That's the one thing I noticed about the 2 Series Gran Coupe, is that it doesn't feel like it's caught in amber. It doesn't feel caught in time. It doesn't feel like it has a less expensive interior than many of the modern BMWs out there. It just feels downsized rather than cheapened. Now, if you want that M235i, it is going to be more expensive at $45,500, and that is about $5,000 more expensive than a base BMW 3 Series. Obviously, our first and most direct competitor here is going to be the Mercedes-Benz CLA. For 2020, we have two different entry-level Mercedes with four doors. We have the CLA and we have the A-Class. The A-Class is the more traditional sedan shape. The CLA is basically the same four-door coupe thing that we have going on with the Gran Coupe. It's going to be a little bit less expensive at $36,650, but prices can be deceiving on the Mercedes line because that's going to be front-wheel drive only, and the Mercedes can get quite a bit more expensive than the BMW if you try.
If you get absolutely carried away with options on your BMW 228i versus the Mercedes-Benz CLA 250, the BMW will still be about $9,000 less. The Mercedes does get quite expensive. Now, obviously, there are going to be features on that CLA that we don't find in the BMW, but you're really going to be paying a pretty penny for them. This may surprise some of you out there, but when it comes to handling, I prefer the CLA. The 228i, I think the problem is the tires. The tires, especially that we had on our model versus the last CLA 250 that we drove, they're just not as aggressive on the BMW. Now, this is something you could logically change yourself aftermarket, but I also think that the suspension tuning and the steering tuning in the CLA is just that little bit better than the 2 Series. On the other hand, I think the BMW is a better value. I think the infotainment system is easier to use, more intuitive. I don't think it's quite as attractive as the infotainment system that we find in the Mercedes, and the BMW instrument cluster isn't as configurable, but I think the BMW system is a little bit easier to use. And I have to admit, I'm partial to the design of the 2 Series a little bit more than the CLA, both on the outside and on the inside. This really is more of a matter of personal preference because parts quality is absolutely excellent in both of these models. The CLA and the 2 Series definitely are downsized or shrunken BMWs and Mercedes. They're not necessarily discount BMW or Mercedes. That is a little bit different than what we used to see in entry-level cars from the Europeans. Our next competitor is the Audi A3. This has been on sale in the US for a little bit longer than BMW has been at the discount entry game. And arguably the A3's sales success is part of the reason that BMW decided to give us the 2 Series Gran Coupe in the first place. The big thing to know about the A3 is that we're getting an all-new A3 for 2021, and that's not the one we're talking about here. We're talking about the 2020. One of the reasons the A3 has been so successful is that it's an excellent value. It starts considerably less than the BMW or the Mercedes at $33,300. Now, admittedly, we don't get as much power in that base A3, but by the time you've comparably priced your A3 to the BMW or the Mercedes, talking about the base versions, of course, then we do get comparable power and comparable performance. But generally speaking, the Audi is going to be a slightly better value than those other German alternatives. Now, the interior does feel just a little bit dated compared to the BMW and Mercedes. I like the design, but parts quality definitely is a semi-step below what we find in the BMW and in the Mercedes. Again, keep in mind the A3 is older and it's getting a complete redesign for 2021, so that shouldn't really surprise too many folks out there. Where Audi really excels is in their drivetrain smoothness. They have a silky DCT. Now, it's not quite as smooth as the traditional automatic that we find in the BMW, but it is more refined than the 7-speed dual clutch that we find on the CLA 250. And I think that the Audi DCT strikes the right balance between performance and smoothness. It is still going to be less smooth than the BMW's transmission out in stop-and-go traffic or slow-and-go traffic, but when you're out on your favorite winding mountain road, it's going to be more engaging than the BMW transmission. Not quite as engaging as what we find in the CLA, but an awful lot smoother than the Mercedes system. And when it comes to competition, that is almost it, really. The Acura ILX, I wouldn't exactly call the most direct competitor. It is more of an inexpensive alternative, but it doesn't have the interior quality, interior refinement, the same sort of luxury features, etc. that we find in the BMW. The Lexus UX is a hatchback, and theoretically it's targeted more at someone that's cross-shopping a BMW X1 or X2. So that brings me along to one of the alternatives that we talked about last time we reviewed the CLA 250, the Volvo S60. Now, the S60, in all fairness, is a 3 Series competitor. BMW has really targeted it size-wise and mid-level and upper-level trims price-wise and interior features-wise with that 3 Series and the Mercedes-Benz C-Class. However, the S60 does get less expensive than those models and will actually start a little bit less than the 2 Series Gran Coupe at $36,300. The intriguing thing about the Volvo comparison is that generally speaking, when we're talking about Volvo versus BMW or Volvo versus Mercedes, driving dynamics are the clear win for the German option, but that's not the case when we're talking about the 228i or the CLA 250. Those are front-wheel drive biased vehicles, just like the Volvo S60. And interestingly enough, the 228i and the S60 use essentially the same 8-speed automatic transmission. Driving dynamics are pretty darn close between all of these 3 models. I think the CLA is the clear winner here. I prefer the way the S60 feels out on the road a bit more, but this has mainly to do with the tires that we find on that versus the 228i. And I suspect if we had comparable tires on the 228i and comparable tires on the S60, that the BMW would be the better handling option because it's a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter than what we see in the S60. Again, remember the S60 is a little bit more 3 Series sized. It has an awful lot more rear legroom, it has a pretty decently sized trunk, and the fit and finish and interior features and luxury options are a little bit more in keeping with the 3 Series. So for instance, if you want massaging seats, a leather stitched dashboard, you'll find that in the S60. You won't find that in the 2 Series because that's not where the 2 Series is playing here. Not to take anything away from Volvo here, but I think the S60 does its best value proposition when pitted against something like the 2 Series rather than the 3 Series. Yes, it's going to be less expensive than the 3 Series, but driving dynamics aren't going to be quite there. However, versus the 2 Series, driving dynamics are going to be pretty similar, but we get a bigger back seat, more feature content on the inside, and the availability of more luxury options than we find in the 228i. If my money were on the line, I would probably get the S60 unless parking was really a tight concern. Then I might look at something that's a little bit smaller. But the S60 is not the toughest competitor for the 2 Series. I think it's actually the BMW 3 Series, most specifically the BMW 330i. Obviously, the 330i is going to have a different character than the 228i or the M235i, and oddly enough, it's priced right between the two. Versus the M235i, the 330i is not going to feel quite as sporty. It's certainly not going to be as fast, but in terms of driving dynamics, the 3 Series is going to be rear-wheel drive and therefore a little bit more my preference. I would personally be willing to give up the thrust that we find in the M235i to get the extra size and the rear-wheel drive dynamics that we find in the 330i. The bottom line difference between the 2 Series and the 3 Series is going to be that driving dynamic, the extra room that we get in the 3 Series, and the nicer interior. Now again, the 2 Series has sort of a shrunken down BMW interior, but you're still going to find a slightly more premium experience inside the 3 Series. You're just going to have to give up a little bit of thrust and some gadgets in order to get the bigger and rear-wheel drive BMW. So when it comes to value, the 2 Series is the winner. But personally, I would be willing to give up a few things here and there to get the bigger size in the 3 Series. And that's possibly why BMW is okay with bringing us something like the 228i, because a lot of folks, I suspect, might go to the BMW dealer, look at the 228i, look and drive the 3 Series, and say, I'm willing to pay the extra to get the 3 Series. I suspect if my own money were on the line and I were going to the BMW dealer, that's probably what I would do. I would look at the 2 Series, I would say that's great value, but I might end up with the 3 Series because the value proposition is still pretty strong in the 3 Series. It's definitely going to be a better value for your feature set than you'll find in the Mercedes-Benz C-Class. Not quite as good of a value as the 2 Series, of course, but you're going to get the extra room, the rear-wheel drive dynamics, and I like the look a little bit better. The 2 Series sort of looks like little kids in dad's clothes, I guess you'd say. It wears the same shapes that we see in the BMW lineup, but not everything is exactly where you'd expect it to be. But the 3 Series has that classic BMW proportion. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. I suspect if my money were on the line, I would get an S60, or I would just get that BMW 3 Series. The S60 is going to be similar priced. The BMW 3 Series is going to be a little bit more, but I also think it's worth the extra cash. Let me know what you think about that down there and what you would pick. And of course, be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos. Find us over at Instagram if you want to see the lighter side of things, Twitter, all those other social things, and I'll see all of you next week.